Hello, and welcome to the fourth lecture in the GeoCurrents series on global demography. Today I'm going to stay in the deep past. I'll talk about population change after the development of agriculture and nomadic pastoralism, so essentially from about 10 to 12,000 BCE up into about 3,000 BCE, before the development of city-states and civilization, if you will. I left off the previous lecture with this map showing the 6 confirmed centers of the independent development of agriculture, which occurred in different places at different times. It also includes actually several possible centers of agricultural development in Africa. But then it also shows lines of diffusion or spread of agricultural practices. I'm going to focus in on a couple of examples here, one in Europe, one in Africa, and one in Southeast Asia and Oceania, and talk about some of the patterns involved in the processes that resulted. So the first would be the Neolithic settlement of Europe. As I discussed before, the first area in which agriculture developed was the so-called Fertile Crescent in the Near East or Middle East, which was quite early, right after the end of the Pleistocene epoch, glacial period, and the beginning of the new, much warmer and wetter Holocene climate. The movement from this center into Europe is well documented. It took actually 2 routes, which I can show here, one up the Rhine River into Central Europe and one into the Mediterranean. But then those different routes branched off and actually met in northwestern Europe and ultimately spread agriculture into the British Isles, into Scandinavia, and essentially across almost all of Europe except the far north. Now, there have been many debates over how this spread of agriculture occurred. It was not a case of hunter-gatherers seeing the new food systems of farming people and adapting them. Rather, it was a case of the spread of the farming people. Another debate is how quickly they spread. Well, we have pretty good dates about this, archaeological dates. But the question is whether this was just a very gradual movement of at the frontier of farming, or whether it was a process that involved more jumps or more sort of migration over longer periods. One thing that looks pretty clear is that early farmers were looking for particular kind of soils, particularly a light and fertile soil called loess. So it was probably some combination of just a gradual spread at the frontier and one of people jumping into new areas sort of ahead. But anyway, what we do know is that the pre-existing hunter-gatherers were not completely wiped out, but they were restricted to peripheral areas. Some in the west, like the Rhine River Delta, modern Netherlands essentially, which was very swampy, marshy at the time, and hence was not amenable to agriculture. That eventually was to happen, but it would take a tremendous amount of diking and draining. Delta rivers, river deltas can be, well, they are generally very fertile areas for farming, but it takes a tremendous amount of labor to transform them into productive farming areas. And hunter-gatherers were also remained most likely in certain mountainous areas in the far north and so on. But we know from genetic analysis that it was pretty much a population turnover or replacement. 90% or so of the genes in Europe at this time, in this early period, would have derived from the new coming farming populations, ultimately from the Near or Middle East. One thing that is very interesting, and I think it was very surprising when it was discovered in the late Neolithic period, around 4000 BCE, not long before the development of copper and then bronze tools and weapons, there was a resurgence of hunter-gatherer DNA in Central Europe. This is from a study based in Czechia, or the Czech Republic. You can see that on the map. Important study that looks at genetics over many centuries, millennia even, and looking at changes in gene frequencies. And they found around 4000 BCE there was a surge. I mean, not a replacement by any means. You can see it on the graph below, showing the percentage of DNA from these Neolithic farmers from ultimately from the Middle East, from Anatolia or Turkey, and you can see them in the yellow, and then European hunter-gatherer DNA that survives and can be found in exhumed skeletons. And you can see this surge, and also seem to involve both hunter-gatherers from the west, places like perhaps the Rhine River Delta, and from Eastern Europe as well. So the Anatolian DNA remained predominant, but definitely a surge is marked. So this seemed to, well, it's hard to say. It's impossible to say what exactly it involved. But the hunter-gatherers were able to remain in their refugia, their refuges, if you will, and then able to expand outwards. We don't know how that happened. Were they healthier than the farmers? There's a good deal of evidence, as I discussed in the last lecture, that human health and nutrition went way down with the development of farming, that hunter-gatherers had better diets and healthier living practices in many ways, partly because they moved around so much, tended to be somewhat larger, better bones, and so on. So presumably even remaining hunter-gatherers may have been healthier, and there seems to have been something of a subsistence crisis in the late Neolithic period in Europe for a variety of reasons. Disease, may have been things like soil exhaustion, reduction of agricultural productivity, but it's interesting you see this a certain surge of these hunter-gatherer genes. This leads to sort of an idea that there are two different major demographic interaction regimes, if you will, between hunter-gatherers and agrarian societies. So in one pattern, like we saw with the Neolithic spread in Europe, farmers basically just replace or genetically swamp out hunter-gatherers or restrict them to certain places and environments that are not amenable to farming. But there's also a second pattern where hunter-gatherers who are in these areas that farmers can't move into, where they increase their population and start to push into agrarian areas and merge with local people. Invariably, in this case, they do adapt agriculture because they're moving from lower population density zones to higher population density zones. And to have the higher population, you need a more effective or efficient food production system. And hunting and gathering can be very effective, but only at low population densities. With higher population densities, you need farming to support them. Anyway, there's very interesting historical linguistic information to support both of these scenarios in different places and different times. So I'll go through a couple of examples. And one would be the spread of the agricultural Bantu-speaking people out of sort of West Central Africa, a process that began a long time ago, 1,000 years BCE, maybe 2,000 years BCE. We can tell this from linguistics. Also, there's archaeological and genetic information that backs it up. So, as that earlier map showed, the area just south of the Sahara had developed agriculture at a fairly early period. Whether it was independent invention or whether it came in from the Middle East is uncertain, but there were definitely farming societies all across Africa, just in the south of the Sahara. But for a long time, areas further south in the southern half of Africa, essentially, were occupied by hunting and gathering peoples at a much lower population density. And Bantu refers to a linguistic family, subfamily actually. All the Bantu languages that can be seen there in the pink color are very closely and obviously related to each other. So you can see it covers a very large chunk of Africa. And it is known that this language family originated where the circle is on the map to the left in, thereabouts, sort of where Nigeria, Cameroon, Gabon, those countries come together. And then there was this spread, multiple different fronts, very gradual. It took a long time, took thousands of years. I should note that the Bantu people, by about pretty early in this process, became users of iron tools and weapons, which was another big advantage they had over hunter-gatherers. But they spread their languages, they spread their genes throughout the area. Not completely by any means. In the far southwest of the African continent, you could see areas that Bantu language didn't spread into. These are areas that were essentially not suitable to their agricultural techniques, either too dry, much of Namibia, Botswana are desert, much part of Western South Africa is. Far Western South Africa is not a desert, it's a Mediterranean climate instead. And the crops from the Mediterranean region grow well there, but these were not the crops that the Bantu had. They had crops that needed summer rain. You don't have summer rain in the far south, and so their crops basically didn't do well. So it was a bit of an environmental divide that maintained a distinction here. And you can see this in a language map. So this map shows language families. Bantu is, you can see Niger-Congo B, because that's a subfamily of Niger-Congo. And then it has these yellow areas. These are the so-called Khoisan languages. They all have clicks, a lot of different clicks, and many. You can articulate a click sound in many places in your mouth. So I think some of these languages have up to a dozen or even more different click sounds. So they were all grouped together because the people sort of seemed similar. They were all hunter-gatherers, as some had later on adopted pastoralism, not with horses, but with sheep and goats and cattle that they had. But none of them were agricultural populations, and they all had these distinctive languages with clicks. Linguistic research shows, however, that you cannot trace out clear family relations. They share certain clicking sounds, but you can't develop sort of language trees of descent. And there are probably maybe 3 different separate languages there. Language families, I'm sorry, a number of different languages, but several different language families that have sort of been grouped together. I want to talk a little bit more about these hunting, gathering, and later pastoral populations in the yellow on the map. Very interesting genetic analysis shows that the people speaking, at least the main group of them, diverge from the rest of humans very early period. So you can see the Science Daily article. It's from a while ago, but this stuff has held out that the Khoisan people speaking these groups of languages, diverged from other people in Africa before the out of Africa migration of anatomically modern humans into the Middle East and across Europe and Asia some 70,000 years ago. So it's interesting if you look carefully on that phylogenetic tree on the right, you can see 200,000 BCE already divergence of southern Khoisan, northern Khoisan, Central African foragers. Those would be, their descendants would be the so-called pygmies. That is it's a pejorative term that should not generally be used. There are different names for these groups. But then you can see East Africans and West Africans and non-Africans, everyone in Europe and Asia, and ultimately the Americas and Australia too, descending from that group. So this is a very, very ancient split. There was some gene flow. They weren't totally isolated, but they're quite distinctive. And one thing this would indicate is that anatomically modern humans living 200,000 years ago in Africa were pretty much like we are today, because these Khoisan people are fully modern human beings by any way of looking at it. So they're very genetically distinctive from other African populations, linguistically distinctive. They might appear physically similar. A lot of that just has to do with, well, say dark skin. That's a feature of adaptation to being in harsh sunlight conditions and needing to protect your skin from ultraviolet radiation, and hence the chance of skin cancer. So the San, or the so-called Bushman Kung, sometimes called in Namibia, Botswana, are probably the best known. You can see up to 160,000. The Hadza in Tanzania. Again, a language with clicks, but doesn't seem to be related to the San. These groups seem to have diverged from each other, way in the distant past as well. I do want to touch on the Hoi Hoi group, who are pastoralists. I love this illustration because these people were much disparaged by the early Europeans, called Hottentots, another term that's considered a pejorative. But they had cattle, sheep, fat-tailed sheep, and goats as well. And so they had a much sort of more complicated material culture, able to move things around on the back of their cattle. It's not really clear how pastoralism came into this region. It came probably from East Africa, but it wasn't something they originally practiced. It came later, but became very important for their way of life. The Hoi Hoi, I mean, most of them essentially disappeared after European conquest, but their descendants are still there. I mean, there are some of these groups, especially in Namibia, but in South Africa, which would have been their major population center, what today you find are the so-called colored population, who are mixed race. So they have European descent, they have some descent from Indonesia even, but the bulk of their descent, especially on the maternal line, is from these indigenous Hoi Hoi pastoralist people. Note on the map on the right, they speak Afrikaans, which was a European language derived from Dutch. And most Afrikaans speakers in South Africa are not white, but rather they're in this colored group. Let's anyway move on to our second example, which would be the agricultural Austronesian speakers. That's another language family, and they replace hunter-gatherers in the islands of Southeast Asia. So again, it's this process of agricultural people being able to support much larger populations in a given area of land, and generally, at least in the early periods, able to outcompete hunter-gatherers, push them into remote areas, swamp them out genetically, however you want to look at it. So the Austronesian languages almost certainly originated in Taiwan. Maybe before that they were in mainland China. About 2% of the population of Taiwan are the so-called Taiwanese Aborigines, but there are some 11 different surviving languages in the mountains on the eastern side of the island of Taiwan. So they're not Han Chinese by any means. Majority of Taiwan's population is. They came much later. But from Taiwan, the center of this language, actually the greatest diversity of Austronesian languages is among these Taiwanese Aboriginal populations. But they were the first people to develop long-distance sailing and navigational techniques, perfected ultimately to such a degree to allow them to settle Polynesia, to be the first people to come to Madagascar, only about 1,700 years ago. These dates are, if they're minus, they're BC or BCE. If they're plus, they're AD or CE, depending on the terms you want to use. They were the first people to come to New Zealand as well. They almost certainly reached Chile. They didn't settle there, but they brought, from Chile or Peru, they brought the sweet potato back. And so it's almost certain that it happened. But anyway, when they moved into the islands of Southeast Asia, they encountered hunter-gatherer populations and pretty much overwhelmed them. There are a few remnant groups. When they moved into what is now usually called Melanesia, you can see this is a French map, so the spelling is a little bit different, but places like New Guinea, just north of Australia, there they found agricultural people. New Guinea was one of those 6 original centers of agricultural domestication, of developing agriculture. Probably sugarcane comes from this area, maybe bananas as well. But they did sort of intermarry with people along the coast, and then they spread beyond that into areas that had never been settled by human beings before, including parts of Melanesia, including essentially all of Polynesia. If you look at modern Southeast Asia today, there's a survival of some hunter-gatherer groups. The usual term is negrito. I'm sure it's considered a pejorative. It is not the best term to use. The Wikipedia is still using it. It's just Spanish for small, dark-skinned people, essentially. So now these people look distinctive from other Southeast Asians. Their genes are distinct. They lost their languages, though. They all except those in the Andaman Islands, which is on the map on the far northwest. That's actually part of India. But everywhere else, they lost their languages and adopted languages of the new coming Austronesians, who were much more numerous and the like. And they were restricted into a few rugged and forested areas, mostly in the Philippines, some in the central area of Malaysia. So I have arrows sort of pointing those out. It's interesting. Some anthropologists have described their later descendants as professional primitives, meaning they did not practice agriculture. They could have picked it up. They didn't. They stayed in these mostly rainforest areas and hunted, gathered rainforest products, and traded those rainforest products with agricultural peoples. Some gene flow, not a whole lot. Like I say, their language did change. They abandoned their original languages, which is interesting. We don't know what happened to it. The Andaman Islands, though, you can see in the map. I've labeled it and put a red line around it. This was the real sort of redoubt of these old stock hunter-gatherers of Southeast Asia, if you will. The Andaman Islands were famous or infamous as a place that mariners did not want to go because the people there were very hostile to them. That's the way they were sort of able to maintain their cultures and languages, despite these settlement everywhere else in the region by peoples from other agricultural peoples from other parts of the world. That ended when the British took over the Andaman Islands. They became a penal colony from British India. Migrants came from other areas. And so you still do find some of these surviving peoples, but not many. The most interesting case, though, and I find it fascinating, is one island here in the Andaman Islands, North Sentinel Island, has remained isolated from the rest of the world to this day. So there have been many efforts over time for outsiders to come in, but the North Sentinelese responded with great hostility. And still, if helicopters fly around it, they come out with their bows and shoot arrows at them. India's actually decided it's a protected area and people are not allowed into it. So nobody really knows anything very much about them except what can be seen from helicopters. 50 people, maybe 400 people there. That's a pretty small population. So a very interesting case, and really there's nothing like it in the world. And one reason why the Sentinelese people are so hostile to the outside world is, well, look what happened to other Andamanese people today. There are only a few thousand of them left. A number of the groups are essentially extinct. The map on the left shows these Andamanese languages in the early 1800s, and then in 2004, and except North Sentinel, what you see is this tremendous restriction. And I have some photos of some of these people. Again, you might look and might think that they look like people from sub-Saharan Africa, but that's just superficial. Genetically, they are much more related to anyone else in Europe and Asia than they are to modern-day African populations. As I mentioned, the Austronesians did not settle much in New Guinea. Some of the coastal languages today are Austronesian. None of the interior languages are. And this was a very different case because New Guinea was already agricultural, already had a much denser population. New Guinea is a fascinating case because it has the largest linguistic diversity in the world. That's a language map on the bottom. And there are 800 to 1,000 different languages in New Guinea out of about 6,000 for the world as a whole. So they developed agriculture quite early, and their languages have been sort of proliferating and dividing into different language families and subfamilies and individual languages and so on. It's also very important to note that the outside world did not know about central New Guinea, which is the population core, which they're large, fairly high altitude plateaus, stretching the length of much of the island. They weren't really integrated with the outside world until the 1920s, when Australian gold prospectors started pushing up into the mountains and found few million people probably living there. So a very interesting case. I'm going to switch to a very different topic, though, and now talk about the opposite pattern of hunter-gatherers expanding into the land of settled farming societies. So there's good evidence that this happened in the late Neolithic Europe and where there's this resurgence of DNA from hunting and gathering groups. We have much better historical data from central Mexico. So the map on the left shows the Chichimec nations. Chichimec is a Nahua or Aztec term for hunter-gatherers who live to their north. So the map on the left, you can see Mexico. That would be Mexico City, the basin of Mexico. That was the center of the Aztec Empire, or Triple Alliance, as it's more properly called. I have a map of that later on. But the Aztecs and other urban state-level peoples of sort of south-central Mexico were not able to move into the land of the Chichimecs because it was too dry for their corn, bean, and squash-based agricultural system. So that was, they basically couldn't move in there. The people there, the so-called Chichimecs, were hunter-gatherers, so they were relatively sparse compared to the actually quite densely populated south-central Mexico. I'll talk about that later on. Very intensive agricultural systems there. But it was a lot of warfare. It was something that the Aztecs were not able to conquer them. It's difficult often for a settled state to conquer a hunter-gatherer population in many cases because they're mobile. They can move out of the way, and it's not like they have cities and farms that can be taken and taxed. So it's sort of a difficult process. The map on the right, it comes from Wikipedia. They have this interesting term, Iridoamerica, with an orange line, basically separating the areas that were essentially agricultural to the south and essentially hunter-gatherers to the north, although there were some pockets of agriculture in many areas, especially if you got north into what is now southwest U.S. So it wasn't like there was no agriculture north of that line, but it was mostly hunter-gatherers, at least in what is now northern Mexico. So one fascinating case, at least I find it fascinating, is the Mexica, or as we generally call them, the Aztecs. Their own origin story is that they were one of these wandering tribes of hunter-gatherers, of Chichimecs. So you can see the map on the left. It actually shows the growth of the Aztec Empire, south-central Mexico. Aztecs really only developed their state in the 15th century. It really only lasted about 100 years, but it was developed in an area of a lot of city-states it had agriculture for a long time, dense population, complex political organization, and so on. But you can also see on the map the arrival of Aztecs from the mythical Aztlan in the 1300s. That's what their stories tell us, and these were very well recorded stories. They had maps that showed it, in their own cartographic idiom. And I have here also on the right an image of the seal from the government of Mexico, which is an eagle eating a snake on a cactus. And so the Aztec legend story, as had been told by one of their gods, keep going south until you come across this. And they found it in the basin of Mexico, and what today would be within Mexico City, on the shores of a large and somewhat brackish lake. I'll talk about that lake later on. It was an out-of-the-way place. There were city-states with dense farming around them, but there were these little areas here and there that were not farmed, and where a hunting-gathering population could situate itself. But then in this more dense population, they developed agriculture. They borrowed cultural traits from all of their neighbors, and actually then became politically very powerful and conquered most of their neighbors. Perhaps I'll talk about that later on. So a fascinating case of hunter-gatherers who, again, was it because they were healthier, because they were more warlike. I mean, there are various sorts of things that you could look at, but it seems to be pretty much undeniable story of hunter-gatherers pushing in to an agricultural area. And we can look at this linguistically as well. There's a language family called Uto-Aztecan, very well established. Its center of diversity is in the western part of the United States. It includes a lot of languages of western Mexico. In the far south, in that green color, is Nahua or Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica or Aztecs. It's still spoken by about 1.5 million people. So it's one of the major indigenous languages still spoken. But most of those groups are hunter-gatherers. There's some debate, but most linguists think that the language family developed in sort of the border area where Mexico, California, Arizona come together. Very dry area, mostly hunter-gatherer populations. And then they spread in different directions. The Comanche, which is one of those pinkish blobs farthest to the east, that's a fascinating case because the Comanche were one of the first Native American groups to adopt horses and become horse riding buffalo hunters, and they created a very powerful political entity from the 1700s to about 1870. One prominent scholar, Pekka Hamalainen, wrote a very celebrated book called Comanche Empire. But hunter-gatherer background, and that's actually an expansion. We can document it historically. So anyway, what I've been talking a lot about is these population movements that often come from local population pressure. I mean, one of the reasons why hunter-gatherers are probably pushing into the lands of farming people is hunter-gathering lifestyle cannot support all that many people in an area, especially in a relatively arid area. So their populations can grow up to such a level that they are putting pressure on the environment, and then they will often move out into other areas, perhaps areas of other hunter-gatherers, or perhaps into agricultural zones. And then agricultural population pressure in agricultural societies, leading to this moving out into peripheral areas and expanding the zone of agriculture. We can see that on a glorious scale with the Austronesians moving all the way to New Zealand, Hawaii, Easter Island, Madagascar. But more important process is agricultural intensification. And I'm not going to talk about that much today because I'll have a whole lecture on population processes where I look at this in much more detail. But things like fertilizing, weeding, watering, terracing, diking, cropping more frequently, breeding more productive crops, adopting more productive crops, and so on. It has its limits and it has its costs, as I will talk about. But then there's another side of it. Well, what about societies that were not able to make these adjustments? They were not able to make the kind of agricultural intensification improvements that would allow their populations to keep growing, or didn't have the opportunity to move into new environments because they were already settled by other farmers. Well, one possibility is just population crashes, and I say a Malthusian response, and I'll talk about Malthus later on in this class. Malthus, one of the first theorizers of demographic patterns, wrote his famous book in the very late 1700s. But Malthusianism is still a term in much use, and it refers to lines of thought that emphasize overpopulation and then concomitant with environmental degradation, and then often with population collapses. Now, it is a complicated story, and so which I will emphasize. But a very prominent book in this genre would be Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. He has a number of cases, and this was a very best-selling book, if you will. One case that he uses, sort of what he thought was his best case, is actually one of his worst, which is Easter Island or Rapa Nui, one of these, actually a very isolated Polynesian island. It was famous for these giant statues, but many scholars thought that what happened is you Polynesians settled it, their population grew, they had fairly complex societies, building these giant stone statues, and then there was a population collapse because of overpopulation and exhaustion of resources. Actually, Contra-Jarrett Diamond Easter Island Society probably did not collapse. New research suggests that population there was never that great, that it didn't take large populations to build and move those stones, and basically it probably had population stabilization. Well, I don't think the debate is over, but that's what current research suggests. There is, however, very strong evidence of population collapses elsewhere. Probably late Neolithic Europe. Now, take this graph with a grain of salt. It's showing population density changes from 10,000 years before present. That would be BP. You can see some ups and downs. No real population plateau or stabilization. According to this, you see this big surge in the late Neolithic, about 4,000 BC, 6,000 years ago, and then this plummeting of population. And there is a lot of evidence that there was a population crisis over much of Europe at this time with greatly reduced population. In fact, there's evidence of several population crashes. So here we have an article, regional population collapse followed initial agricultural booms in mid-Holocene Europe. Now, what was the reason for this population crash? Well, there are a variety of theories and sort of theories that combine different ideas. But it's looking increasingly like the bubonic plague. Well, this seems to be the first time the bubonic plague made a devastating appearance in Europe at any rate. So the Smithsonian article, Did Plague Cause the Mysterious Collapse of Europe's First Farmers? 5,000 years ago. A lot of archaeological excavations, exhuming skeletons, testing them, and finding, well, not just evidence of death from bubonic plague, but actually genetic material from Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. That's there between the teeth. Well, this shows about 1 in 6 people appeared to be infected. David Reich argues that could have been much, much higher. Actually, evidently, they've pulled out bones out of plague pits from medieval Europe. And there were people who, their bones were there because they died of the plague, but they don't find the genetic signature of Yersinia pestis in all of them. So it may have been death rate of, well, the death rate in the 14th century in the so-called Black Death in Europe was 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. I'll talk about that later. So this begs the question, well, why did the plague strike at this time? And there's a couple of things going on, probably. One idea is that health was very poor. And we'll see this later when we look at the Black Death, or if we look at the even bubonic plague today. Bubonic plague is still around. A few people die of it every year. There's bubonic plague in a lot of rodents in the United States. Ground squirrels in particular, sort of a reservoir of this. But it generally doesn't spread. I think, if I remember right, the last sort of significant number of plague deaths in the United States was from San Francisco in the early 1900s, and it came from one neighborhood of San Francisco. It came from Chinatown. Chinese people in California had been basically kicked out of their homes and forced to live in an extraordinarily densely populated corner of San Francisco. Very poor, very crowded conditions. That's the sort of thing that can lead to the spread of something like plague. So generally, really healthy, well-fed, well-nourished populations are not necessarily vulnerable to plague. They can be. I mean, we don't really know. There's different levels of virility and different sort of strains. But from the previous article, just to quote Mark Thomas, an evolutionary geneticist at University College London, who first identified the Neolithic population collapse, claims the decline was likely due to a larger combination of factors, including exhaustion of the soil. Okay, that's overpopulation, really. or it's one way to look at it, overpopulation without making the agricultural intensification developments necessary to support a larger population. That's a better way of looking at it. But then additionally, poor health was widespread in the area. Neolithic people were very compromised. We should say late Neolithic people in terms of general health. Their bones look bad. And you can tell a lot from bones. The area where bubonic plague probably originated was the great steppes or grasslands of Central Eurasia, seen on the map here. A lot of ground squirrels, large ground squirrels like a marmot or woodchuck as we call them, and other kind of ground squirrels as well. The Black Death of medieval Europe, its DNA has been traced to northern Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia, a grassland area. So how did the plague get into late Neolithic Europe from this probable reservoir somewhere in Central Asia? Well, one idea is, it's a pretty convincing idea really, is that steppe nomads were pushing into Europe at the same time. So this map is a bit outdated, but it shows the what's known as the Yamnaya culture. This is an archaeological culture, people living in the grasslands of southern Russia, a bit into Ukraine, a bit into Kazakhstan. So these were people dwelling in the grasslands. Right around, about 3,500 BCE or so, the Yamnaya people, most likely them or people related to them, domesticated the horse and then developed horse-based pastoralism. There were people who had been in marginal environments herding goats and sheep and cattle. You can do it on foot, but if you have horses and can ride them, you can manage much larger herds. And what looks to have happened is around 3,500 BC or so, the Yamnaya people had been living in river valleys, sort of semi-forested, had probably been engaging in a little bit of farming, some hunting and gathering, and then they moved out into the open steppes. They did so because, it's an environment that they could, previously had very few people living in it, but it has abundant fodder for herds. So if you have cattle and sheep and goats, then they developed wagons. This is very early use of wheeled vehicles, so they could carry their necessary goods in these wagons and move across the steppe with vast herds of animals. They were not just eating them, but they were using the dairy products from them as well. And it spread fast. This might even be called a Yamnaya population explosion. It wasn't as much of an explosion of that happened, say, in the late 1800s, early 1900s with the development of modern medicine. But this was a new environment that had not been much used by people at all, very extensive. They had a way of life that could produce a lot of food and high protein, high fat food with meat and dairy products. And they probably did engage in a little bit of agriculture. They traded with agricultural people, so it wasn't like they had no familiarity with it. We know from their language that they did have some familiarity. But this was just a staggeringly fast movement. This is something David Reich, geneticist at Harvard, one of the main researchers on history of human genetics. In the earlier lecture, I advised people to watch interview with Dwarkesh Patel, interviewing David Reich and talking about that, and in other videos too. And there are plenty of other people who have very interesting articles and videos on this subject. But you can find, people have found Yamnaya burials. They had quite elaborate burials from their homeland in the western steppe, and then you could find them almost at the same time all the way over there in central part of Eurasian continent. And culturally, genetically, they're virtually identical. So this was a real fast movement. The map is just sort of a migration route, but basically the whole culture spread over that area. So I bring this up partly because it shows that there were what we might call population explosions in certain times and places in deep history. And it's often a case of people coming into a new environment or developing a new way of life that produces abundant food and can allow this kind of expansion. So anyway, we know that the migratory pastoralists from Central Asia spread their languages, Indo-European languages, and about half the people in the world speak an Indo-European language. Almost everyone from Europe or European background, but also northern 2/3 of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Iran. You find these Indo-European languages. This shows the situation not today, but about hypothesized about circa 1000 BCE. And these languages almost certainly derived from the Yamnaya and perhaps some related groups who were these early horse-based pastoral nomads. So not only did they spread across the steppe, then they started spreading into farming societies. They started combining with some other groups, moving into Central Europe, and their languages replaced those that were spoken there previously. Now, there were a couple of survivals. One survival to this day, Basque. The map is showing it mostly in southwest France, as it was for a long time. Today it's mostly in sort of central northern Spain, but a few million speakers. There are some other non-Indo-European languages in Europe, like Finnish, Estonian, Hungarian. Hungarian came in much later. Finnish came, I'm not going to go into Finnish now. It's a very interesting case. We also have some that were spoken in the classical world, like Etruscan and Iberian in Spain. They went extinct as well. So definitely a huge spread of these languages, and eventually into India. The map shows about 1000 BC, but it would spread all the way across into the eastern part of India. Not all the way to the south, but about 2/3 down the peninsula. Well, these people spread their genes as well, and that's absolutely clear. So again, I showed part of this this graph before from this big study in Czechia. When I talked about the Anatolian DNA coming in with the Neolithic farmers, replacing most of the hunter-gatherer DNA, then the hunter-gatherer resurgence. But then look at that, just really fast movement, or change, I should say, to mostly steppe ancestry, and you could tell it from the genetics. The map on the right above it shows the Yamnaya. They moved into Hungary, which is a grassland area. They did not move into the forested lands of Central Europe, but you have the corded ware group that comes from their pottery. It was marked with imprints of ropes or other cords. But the corded ware people themselves were related to the Yamnaya. Maybe they came from an area just to the north of the Yamnaya, where you have sort of a steppe and forest mixing together, but people who were also migratory, mostly pastoralists. They moved into Central and Northern Europe. They spread their pottery, obviously, but they also spread their language and their genes. And not a complete replacement, but a very heavy one. Now, this happened when the Neolithic populations were collapsing from perhaps overpopulation or ill health, but well, it wasn't overpopulation anymore. The bubonic plague greatly reduced that, almost certainly. So you had societies that were under serious stress. It's probably the initial movement of these people may well have brought in the bubonic plague. And then they are also almost certainly a very aggressive group who then took over by and large. Here's a very interesting map, and it shows ancestry, genetic ancestry. So if you go to the red box, you can see in all those pie graphs, the wedges, or in some cases the entire pie, is black. That means Yamnaya or steppe ancestry associated with the speakers of Proto-Indo-European languages. And you can see, for example, corded ware, Central Europe, it's about 2/3 ancestry from the steppe. Now, we have both male and female lineages coming from the Yamnaya. So Yamnaya women were, or steppe women were moving in, but probably many more men. You can see much more replacement, for example, of the Y chromosome carried by men, and much more of a survival of the earlier mitochondrial lineages or haplogroups, and that spread in the female line. So it's interesting. You could see as you move away from the Yamnaya core in Europe, you could see sort of a reduction of this steppe ancestry. So about half in the British Isles, and right where sort of France and Germany come together, about a little less than a quarter in Iberia. And you can see it in the other direction as well. So that you can see in the Altai top of the map there, it's almost complete. That's just where they moved and continued to practice pastoralism. But then as they spread into Central Asia and eventually into India, you can see a declining percentage. There's a lot of speculation about this. Some would say that this was a genocide, the Yamnaya and their relatives, early recorded where people coming in and just wiping out the existing population. That may not have been happening. It may have been the plague that did most of the wiping out. I have the term, or perhaps androcide, here because interesting but disturbing fact that's come up is, in many cases, the pre-existing Y haplogroups. This is genetic material spread in the male line from father to son, grandson, great-grandson, and so on. There are most places are almost completely replaced. The pre-existing male haplogroups just disappear, or almost disappear, and instead you get almost entirely these haplogroups at this time from the steppe zone. So here's a fascinating case of the Basques, who kept their non-Indo-European language, the only one in Western Europe who has kept it to this day. But they essentially lost their initial Y chromosomes. So from this Harvard Magazine article, I'll quote in bold print there, one migration from Central Europe replaced nearly the entire male population of the entire Iberian Peninsula between 4,500 and 4,000 years ago, raising a host of questions about sex and culture in that region. Yes, a lot of questions raised. So the most extreme interpretation, plenty of people hold it, some are sort of sheepish about saying it, is that you had people originally from the steppe cultures, and then later from these more mixed cultures in Europe, but they had probably derived from the steppe people, developed a culture where a lot of young men would leave the society, often for many years, often permanently, would go into new areas, would engage in violence, perhaps kill many or as many as they could men in a given society, and basically rape, enslave, then you could, I suppose, say marry the women from these societies. Now, that's one interpretation. We do know, though, that there were repeated population turnovers. I don't have an article citation for this in this lecture, but cases from even within some of these particular cultures, something called the funnel beaker. Well, I won't go into that detail again, but when they look specifically at the Y haplogroups, they've actually been able to find, even within a particular sort of archaeological society, if you will, sometimes there's a sharp replacement of one haplogroup on the Y chromosome with a closely related one, seemingly indicating that men from outside came in and replaced the men. So anyway, there are different interpretations, different ways of thinking about this, different consequences. What propelled this migration? Was it population pressure among the steppe peoples and their descendant groups that results in migration? The migrant violence and the diseases that they may bring then reduces the populations in these new environments and helps them move in and sort of take over societies. In some cases, it may be more of a case just of elite male, by elite, I mean warrior elites, who then could become sort of too populous within their society. It's hard to have a society where all the men are warrior elites, but maybe they're too numerous, so they're pushing out and replacing men. Now, it has been suggested, and David Reich makes this suggestion in the article I mentioned, maybe it's local women who are choosing to mate with these migrant men. I think that is highly unlikely. To imagine yourself in this situation as a woman. Your society is in deep stress. Would you preferentially mate with a man coming in from the outside who doesn't speak your language, doesn't have your culture? Is probably very prone to violence. Now, on the other hand, I have to say, some archaeologists would say, well, we haven't found sites where we see huge massacres. We haven't uncovered many of them there, but most events like that are not recorded or recovered in the archaeological record. So the questions are still open. There are many ways to interpret it. There are population implications no matter how you look at it. I think my second to last slide here is a movie poster from a relatively recent film. I just watched it recently. I must say, I had a really hard time watching it. I turned it off. It was so grotesquely violent. Ultimately, I did watch it out to the end. I do like dramatizations of historical processes, even if they're not particularly good ones. I will often watch them. And this is actually, in many ways, though, a very good film, but just marked with this horrific violence. It takes place much later. I mean, we're talking about the Iron Age. We're talking about the, into historical times, only about 1,200 years ago. The so-called Vikings or Northmen coming out of Scandinavia, and this film portrays one of these societies where. Well, it's sort of almost a retelling of the Hamlet story, where Hamlet originally comes from. But it was a young Viking prince whose uncle murders his father. He ends up fleeing. In this movie, he goes into what is now Russia and Ukraine, killing lots of men and enslaving both men and women and sending slaves. And ultimately, he's searching out his uncle. He pretends to be a slave to go to Iceland and to get revenge. It's a very disturbing and very interesting movie. It also is done with the assumption that Norse mythology is true. So Odin is sending out his ravens to help this guy. So it probably is not everybody's cup of tea. But it is based very heavily on Norse mythology and on actually a lot of ideas that scholars now have about how these processes worked. It's a disturbing story. And if you want to study deep human history, you have to, I think you have to face these issues. There have been a number of scholars who have not wanted to do so, who've imagined that until the modern state developed, people were pretty much peaceful and friendly. But the evidence that we're getting from genetics, even from archaeology, portrays a very different situation of a lot of quite desperately poor populations. Things might be good for a while, but then population may build up, or as we'll see in the next lecture, weather events, climate change, temporary climate change, can often then result in crises which push people out into new environments. So let's just take the last slide here. The Viking raids and settlements in this period. There's a lot of evidence that Scandinavia had become overpopulated given its resources. It was agricultural long since been agricultural. I probably should have mentioned that these pastoral peoples who moved into Europe did readopt agriculture, if you will. Although they kept some pastoral practices, but they, as population built up, you really don't have any option but to take up agriculture, and if you have an agriculturally possible environment. But you can see the Vikings from their homeland in southern Sweden, Norway, Denmark. Then you could see their expansion, and you could also see areas where they settled intensively, including some very difficult environments. They're exaggerating in Greenland. They were only right on the coast, but that was not a favorable environment. But yet, then eventually the climate changed again, and they were not able to maintain their populations there. But they were there for a few hundred years. So this would indicate a situation where population pressure was one of the issues. And these were some very bloody incursions over a huge area, into the Mediterranean, all the way down to the Black Sea, down to the Caspian Sea. Some areas just raided for slaves to a very large extent, but everything else they could get their hands on of value, but also a lot of areas where there was a settlement. So I will end there. The next lecture will take up the question of population patterns and processes after the development of civilization, meaning the state, urbanization, development of literacy, and so on. So I hope you, if you're interested, if you can tune into that. Thank you.